The royal healer's hands were trembling when she pressed them gently against Isabella's stomach. Not from fear, not from illness, from pure, overwhelming joy. She was pregnant. 3 years of being called barren. 3 years of whispers that stopped the moment she walked in. 3 years of watching her husband defend her with his name and his crown. Tonight she finally had the news that would silence all of it. She walked to his chambers with tears in her eyes and a smile she couldn't hold back. Then a scent stopped her at the door. Floral. Heavy. A woman's perfume that didn't belong there. She pushed it open anyway, and she saw her. Serafina Vale. Dark hair loose. Gown barely settled. Sitting close enough to Damien that their voices were nothing but murmurs and his hand resting near hers like it had been there before. She pressed herself into the shadows and held her breath. Then she heard his voice low, certain, and devastating. I need heirs, Serafina. The kingdom needs a Luna who can give me children. She was standing at that door holding the best news of her life. And she never said a word. She went back to her chambers in tears, packed 2 bags, left a letter on his pillow, and walked out of Blackthorn Keep before sunrise. What he never knew, what no one knew, was that she didn't leave alone. Inside her, 2 tiny heartbeats had only just begun. Hi viewers. Before we go further, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. If you were Isabella, standing outside that door, holding the best news of your life, and you heard the person you loved most say those words, would you have walked in and confronted him? Or would you have done exactly what she did, packed your things, protected your heart, and disappeared before sunrise? Drop your answer below. Type confront if you would have faced him, or type gone if you would have walked away just like she did. I read every single comment, and I want to know where you stand. And if you are new here, welcome. Stories like this one are what we do. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss one. Now, let's find out what happened 7 years later. Chapter 1. 7 years later. The Frost Mountains did not forgive weakness. That was something Isabella had learned in the first brutal winter after she arrived. The cold came sharp and early and stayed long past the point where any reasonable person expected warmth to return. The villages at the mountain's base were small and quiet and suspicious of strangers. The people kept to themselves, worked hard, and asked almost no questions, which was exactly what Isabella had needed. She had built a life here from nothing. She had learned to trade at the market, to mend roof tiles before the snow came, to make a small house feel full. She had learned to sleep through loneliness, to smile through exhaustion, to breathe through grief until it became manageable. And she had learned to be a mother. Her children were 6 years old now. Elias was the quiet one. He sat in corners and watched. He asked questions that had no quick answers and then waited patiently for the long ones. He had a habit of picking up small rocks and turning them over in his palm, studying them for longer than any other child his age ever would. He had his father's stillness, that particular kind of calm that wasn't emptiness but depth, and he had his father's eyes, green and sharp and entirely too knowing for a boy who had barely reached Isabella's waist. Isabella had stopped being startled by those eyes after the first year. She had simply learned to look at them with a full heart and a closed throat and keep moving. Aurora was nothing like quiet. She was noise and color and relentless forward motion. She decided things before she was asked and then defended those decisions with a stubbornness that made Isabella want to laugh and pull her hair out simultaneously. She climbed things that weren't meant to be climbed. She spoke first and considered consequences later. She smiled with her whole face, a broad, unguarded, completely disarming smile, and she had no idea that the smile was not entirely her own. It belonged to someone else, someone far away, someone who did not know she existed. It was Aurora who found the letter first. She came running across the kitchen floor, bare feet slapping stone, hair flying, one hand clutching a folded envelope sealed in deep red wax. The seal was a wolf's head carved into the center, surrounded by climbing vines. The seal of the Blackwood Kingdom. Isabella's hands went still around the mug she was holding. She set it down carefully. She turned the envelope over once, then again. Mama, who sent it? Aurora was already reaching for the seal because of course she was. Isabella caught her hand gently. "Let me open it," she said quietly. She broke the seal. The parchment inside was thick and formal and smelled faintly of the expensive beeswax that only the royal household used. She unfolded it slowly. The script at the top read in elegant, practiced ink. "By royal decree of the crown, you are hereby invited to bear witness to the union of Alpha King Damian Blackwood and Lady Seraphina Vale, to be joined in mated bond at the full moon ceremony at Blackthorn Keep." Isabella read it twice. Her jaw tightened in a way she had not felt in years. Elias appeared quietly in the kitchen doorway, watching her face the way he always watched when something was wrong. He didn't ask. He just waited. Isabella set the letter on the table. She stood and walked to the window and looked out at the gray slope of the mountain, at the pine trees heavy with old snow, at the pale winter sky. She breathed in. She breathed out. She felt the familiar cold anger move through her like a current finding its way through stone. He was getting married. He was marrying Seraphina Vale, the woman he had chosen while Isabella was still his wife. The woman he had selected to replace her with, to carry heirs she apparently could not. And he had the nerve to send her an invitation. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the reasons not to go. The distance alone was reason enough. The exposure, the risk of being seen, of the children being recognized, of anyone asking the questions that had no safe answers. She thought about Elias's green eyes and Aurora's smile. And then, somewhere near dawn, a different feeling moved through her. He was going to stand in that great hall and marry another woman, and the entire kingdom was going to watch, and no one was going to say anything about what he had done. He was going to be celebrated. His court was going to raise their glasses and speak his name with pride, and Isabella Frost was going to be the woman who disappeared, the barren Luna who couldn't hold her husband's heart. She got up. She began to pack. She wanted him to see her. She wanted him to look at her and feel it, whatever it was he had buried when she left. She wanted to stand in his kingdom one more time, tall and unhurt looking, with her children beside her. She wanted Blackthorn Keep to understand that she was not a woman to be pitied. 3 days of travel through mountain passes and rolling lowlands brought them to the castle she had once called home. Blackthorn Keep looked exactly as she remembered it and not the same at all. The walls were higher, or perhaps they only seemed that way. The banners were new. The torches at the gate burned a deeper gold. Servants moved quickly through the courtyard with flowers and ribbons, and the particular nervous energy of a household preparing for something enormous. Isabella kept her hood up until they passed through the main gate. The twins were wide-eyed and silent. Even Aurora had gone quiet, her head turning slowly to take in the scale of everything around her. Elias walked close to Isabella's side, his hand finding hers without either of them saying anything about it. The great hall was already filled with music and candlelight and the murmur of 100 conversations. Isabella stepped inside. And then, as though the room already knew, everything seemed to slow. She lowered her hood. She was standing near the edge of the entrance when she felt it. Not a sound. Not a movement. A pressure like a change in the air. She looked up slowly. At the far end of the hall, Damian Blackwood stood in conversation with 2 men she did not recognize. He was wearing the deep charcoal of the Blackwood house, his crown resting low on dark hair that was slightly longer than she remembered. His jaw was sharper. His shoulders were broader. 7 years had not diminished him. If anything, they had pressed something harder into his face. Not cruelty, but weight. The weight of a man who had carried something heavy for a long time. He had not seen her yet, but in the next moment, before she could step back, before she could return the hood to her head, he turned. His eyes found her across the distance of that hall. And then they moved, almost involuntarily, to the 2 children standing on either side of her. The conversation he was having stopped mid-sentence. His cup lowered slowly. His gaze moved from Elias to Aurora, from Aurora back to Elias, and then back to Isabella with an expression she had no name for. Something between recognition and confusion and a pain that looked far older than this moment. Isabella did not look away. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, then turned and walked toward the side corridor, her children following quickly behind her. Her pulse was pounding in her ears. Her hands were perfectly still. Chapter 2. You're our father, aren't you? Isabella should not have brought them into the main hall. She knew that the moment she stepped back into the crowd, trying to keep Aurora close and Elias calm while navigating through clusters of dressed nobles and circling servers. She was looking for a seat near the edge of the room, somewhere visible enough to satisfy the hard, cold purpose that had brought her here, and somewhere close enough to a corridor that she could disappear quickly if she needed to. What she had not accounted for was Aurora. Aurora had gone very still, which was always a warning sign. She was standing a few feet away, head slightly tilted, staring across the room with the focused intensity of a child who had just noticed something she couldn't explain. Isabella followed her daughter's gaze. Damien had moved closer. He was standing near the edge of the room now, speaking to no one, his eyes fixed on the twins with an expression that had abandoned all pretense of neutrality. Isabella took a step forward. Aurora! But Aurora was already moving. She crossed the floor with that particular fearless walk she had, chin slightly raised, no hesitation, and she stopped directly in front of the Alpha King of the Blackwood Kingdom. A hush moved outward from them like a stone dropped in still water. Damien looked down at her. Aurora looked up at him. She tilted her head slightly. And then she asked, in a voice that carried clearly through the silence she had created around them, "Why do you keep staring at us? Are you our father?" The ballroom went absolutely still. Isabella's heart stopped in her chest. She watched Damien's face, watched the careful control he usually wore crack completely open for just a single second. His eyes moved from Aurora to Elias, who had followed his sister quietly and was now standing just behind her, looking up at Damien with those green eyes that were so precisely, so undeniably, a mirror of the man before him. Damien exhaled, a long, slow breath. He crouched down so he was level with Aurora, which was not what Isabella expected him to do. He studied her face carefully, the set of her jaw, the line of her brow, the exact shape of that smile she hadn't yet used but that was already there in the potential of her expression. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Aurora," she said. "Aurora Blackwood Frost." Someone in the crowd made a sound. Damien's jaw tightened. He stood slowly and looked at Isabella, who had crossed the floor to stand beside her children. His expression was controlled again, but only barely, only at the surface. Beneath it, something was tearing. "Isabella," he said. "Not here," she said. Her voice was lower than she intended it to be. "My private study." Now, it was not a request, but it was not unkind either. That was the part that confused her. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for the cold authority of a king who felt challenged in front of his court. She had not prepared for the look on his face that resembled, far too closely, grief. She sent the twins to stay with the elderly governess Damien quietly directed to receive them. She followed him through the hall and up a narrow flight of stairs and into the dark book-lined study she remembered from years ago. He lit a candle. He stood with his back to her for a moment, one hand on the edge of the desk, the other pressed to his mouth. Then he turned around. "When were they born?" Isabella lifted her chin. 6 years ago." Something moved across his face like a physical blow. "You were pregnant when you left." It was not a question. "Yes," she said. The silence after that word was immense. Damien stood perfectly still. He wasn't looking at her the way she expected, not with accusation, not with the cold fury of a king who felt deceived. He was looking at her with the particular devastation of a man who was only now doing the arithmetic of what he had lost. 6 years, 2 children, their names, their faces, their first words, their first shift, all of it gone, not known, not witnessed, not his. "Bella." His voice broke slightly on that single syllable. "Don't," she said, and her own voice came out rougher than she wanted. "You could have told me. You already had someone to give you heirs," she said, and despite every effort, the bitterness she had spent 7 years pressing down rose through the words. "I didn't want to inconvenience your arrangements." Damien looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know what you think you saw," he said carefully, "but those are my children, and I am going to know them." He said it quietly, without heat, without threat. The certainty in it was more difficult to argue with than anger would have been. Isabella said nothing. She turned toward the door. Behind her, his voice came again, quieter this time. "Those are my children, Bella." She paused with her hand on the doorframe. She did not turn around. "I know," she said, and then she walked out. Chapter 3. The family they could have been. In the days that followed, Isabella watched Damien from a distance and felt the ground beneath every certainty she had built shifting slowly out from under her. He was different with the twins than she expected. She had imagined he would be formal, stiff, a king performing the role of father with the same careful distance he brought to everything official. She had thought Aurora would exhaust his patience within an afternoon and Elias would bore him with his silences. She was wrong about all of it. Aurora had decided, with the absolute authority she brought to all her decisions, that Damien was acceptable. She had announced this to Elias on the second morning as Isabella watched through a window above the training courtyard. Damien had come down to find both children already there. Aurora sitting on top of a stacked hay bale she definitely wasn't supposed to climb. Elias standing at the fence studying the horses with concentrated attention. He had stood there for a moment, looking at them. And then he had walked over to Elias, stood beside him, and without any preamble at all, begun to explain quietly which horse was which and why the gray one in the corner was faster than it looked. Elias had listened to every word. That evening, Aurora demanded to learn how to use a training sword. Damien looked at Isabella. A quick glance, checking, the smallest gesture of courtesy that surprised her, and when she said nothing to stop it, he found a wooden practice sword that was light enough for Aurora's grip and showed her the first position. Within an hour, they were both laughing. Not politely, not performing. Aurora kept overcorrecting and toppling sideways with dramatic flair, and Damien was laughing a real laugh, the one that started in his chest, and it was so familiar that Isabella had to press her back against the stone wall and look away for a moment to recover herself. She had not heard that laugh in 7 years. She had convinced herself she didn't miss it. She had been lying to herself. On the third day, she came looking for Aurora in the late afternoon and found Damien seated on a wide stone bench in the castle garden. A map spread across his knee, pointing out territories to Elias, who was pressed close against his arm, studying the map with the same focused attention he gave everything. Aurora was asleep. She was curled on the bench beside Damien, her head leaning against his arm, deeply, completely, absolutely asleep in the way that only very small children and very tired people can sleep, with total trust. Damien had gone very still so as not to wake her. He looked up and saw Isabella standing at the edge of the garden. Their eyes met. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. She stood there and looked at her daughter asleep against this man's arm and felt something she had worked very hard to bury break its way back to the surface. That night, Elias asked Damien a question. They were sitting near the fire after dinner, and Isabella was in the adjoining room, and she heard it clearly through the open archway. "If you had known about us," Elias said carefully, in that quiet, precise way he spoke when the question mattered, "would you have stayed?" There was a pause. "I would have come for you," Damien said. "I would have crossed every mountain between us. You and your sister would have known who you were from the beginning." Elias considered that. "Our mother doesn't talk about you," he said, not unkindly, just honestly. "I know," Damien said. "She kept your ring, though," Elias said. "She wears it on a chain, inside her dress. She thinks we don't notice." Another pause. Isabella's hand went instinctively to the chain at her neck. She pressed herself silently against the wall of the adjoining room and closed her eyes and breathed. The next evening, Aurora waited until Damien had finished a conversation with one of his advisors, then walked up to him with the directness she applied to everything important. She looked up at him steadily. "Do you still love our mother?" The question landed in the quiet of the room. Damien did not answer immediately. In the silence, Isabella, standing in the doorway unseen, pressed a hand to her mouth and stood very still. He never answered with words, but the pause itself was an answer of its own. Chapter 4. The truth about the night she left. It happened on the 5th evening. Damien found Isabella alone in the East Gallery, standing before a long oil portrait of the Blackwood line that stretched back generations. She was looking at it without really seeing it. She felt him before she heard him, the specific quality of his presence, something her body had not forgotten how to recognize no matter how many years she spent refusing to think about it. He came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "You're still angry," he said. "I was never angry," she said. And then, after a pause, "I was destroyed." He turned toward her. "Then tell me what you saw," he said, "because I have spent 7 years trying to understand why you left, and nothing has ever made sense to me. You left no explanation that I could believe. Your letter said only that you were sorry and that it was better this way. That is not an explanation." "You know what I saw," she said. "I don't. I promise you I don't." The frustration and disbelief rose through her before she could stop it. She turned to face him. "I came to your chambers that night," she said. "I had just left the healer. I was coming to tell you." She stopped, steadied herself. "I was coming to tell you I was pregnant, and I opened your door and Serafina was beside you, and your hand was near hers, and you said," her voice lowered, "you said you needed heirs, that the kingdom needed a Luna who could give you children." The color drained from Damien's face. Not the flush of being caught. The gray of a man who has just understood something terrible. "What time?" he said quietly. "It was late. Near midnight. The guards weren't at your doors." Damien's hands had gone still at his sides. His jaw was working slowly. "Isabella," he said, "I was not in my chambers that night. Near midnight I was in the lower garrison with Cale Stormborn and 4 of my guard captains, reviewing the border dispute with the Eastern Territories. There were 12 witnesses. I didn't return until well past the 3rd hour." Isabella stared at him. "That is impossible," she said. "I saw you." "You saw someone," he said. "It was not me." The certainty in his voice was absolute. Not the certainty of a man constructing a defense. The certainty of a man recalling where he was because it had been an entirely ordinary evening that he had no reason to lie about or embellish. "I didn't understand why you left," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I searched for you. For months. I sent people into every territory. I read your letter until it fell apart in my hands trying to find the thing I had done that was large enough to make you disappear completely." He exhaled. "And there was nothing," he said, "because I never betrayed you." Isabella felt the floor moving. Everything she had carried for 7 years. Every night she had pressed her grief into the dark and converted it slowly into hardness. Every morning she had looked at Elias's eyes and Aurora's smile and told herself it was better this way, that the man was not the man she thought he was, that she had made the right choice. All of that was shifting. "Damien," she said, and the word came out sounding like something breaking. He crossed the distance between them. His hands found her face, gentle, trembling slightly, and he pressed his forehead to hers exactly the way he always had when he had no words left. She grabbed the front of his jacket with both hands, not to push him away. She didn't have the strength for that anymore. "I looked for you everywhere," he said, against her hair, just above a whisper. "Every single day for a year." She let herself lean into him for exactly a few seconds, and then her eyes opened, and she heard a door down the hall and footsteps, and Serafina's voice drifting from somewhere below, and the full weight of where they were and what was still unresolved came back down on her. She stepped back. Damien let her go immediately, but his hands were slow to leave her face. "There's still something you don't know," she said quietly. "Something that makes no sense in what I saw that night. If it wasn't you, then someone made you believe it was." Their eyes held. Neither of them said the rest of it out loud, but they were both already starting to understand. Chapter 5. The man wearing Damien's face. The twins found it first. Elias had been wandering the castle's lower corridors that morning. He did this often, drawn to maps and old stonework and the particular kind of thinking that only quiet spaces allowed. Aurora was trailing behind him with the patience she reserved exclusively for her brother, which was to say almost none. They turned a corner and nearly walked directly into Damien. Or who looked like Damien. He was dressed the same. He moved the same. But Aurora stopped walking. She stood very still. "Good morning," the man said in Damien's voice, with Damien's slight downward inflection. He smiled. Elias looked at him carefully. Aurora did not smile back. There was a pause. "You forgot," Aurora said slowly, "that he always calls us by our names first." The man's smile held exactly a half-second too long. "Come here," he said. "No," said Aurora. She grabbed Elias's hand. "Run." They ran. They ran through corridors and down a back staircase that Elias had scouted 2 days earlier, through a low door that opened onto a service passage, and through the passage until they found a wall that had no door. Elias pressed his hands to the stone. He could feel something behind it, air moving. A gap. He pushed, and a hidden panel swung inward. Behind them, footsteps were growing louder. They slipped through the hidden passage and pressed themselves against the wall in the dark. The footsteps passed the panel door and continued down the corridor. Both children breathed slowly and quietly, listening until the sound faded completely. "He looked exactly like Father," Elias said. "I know," Aurora said, "but he didn't feel like Father." "What do you mean?" Aurora thought about it. "Father looks at us like we belong to him," she said finally. "That man looked at us like we were a problem." They found Isabella together, pulling her quickly away from a conversation with a court attendant, talking in the overlapping way they did when something was urgent. Isabella listened. Her expression changed. She had been thinking about what Damien said the night before, about the garrison, about the witnesses, about someone making her believe she had seen something she hadn't. She went looking for Damien immediately, but she found Serafina first. Serafina Vale was standing in the upper corridor near the library, and the expression on her face when she saw Isabella was something different from what it had been. The polished composure was still there. It was always there, but underneath it something had slipped. A kind of desperate calculation that she wasn't quite managing to hide. "You should leave," Serafina said quietly. "You came back. You've shown everyone you're alive, and now you should take your children and go home." "Who was in Damien's chambers that night?" Isabella asked. The silence was answer enough. "It was your brother," Isabella said. "Lucian." Serafina's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lucian has always had a gift for appearances," she said, which was not a denial. "And what exactly is his gift?" Isabella asked. "Our bloodline carries an old ability," Serafina said, as though she were discussing something boring and inconsequential. "Illusion work. Nothing permanent. Just enough to change how a person appears to another person for a short time." Isabella stared at her. "You staged it," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "I needed you to believe what you saw," Serafina said, and now her voice had dropped its pretense of being reasonable. "You were never right for him. You know that. The court knew that. The council knew that. I simply helped you arrive at the conclusion you were going to arrive at eventually." "He was drugged," Isabella said. "That night. You kept him away from his chambers so Lucian could take his place." Serafina said nothing, which was everything. "You took 7 years from them," Isabella said. "From him. From my children. I gave Damien the future he needed," Serafina said, and her voice had hardened. "And if you stand in the way of that future now," she paused. The calculation in her eyes was not warm. "Neither can you have him, Isabella, if I cannot." Isabella felt the chill of that statement long after she turned away. She went to find Damien. He wasn't in the study. He wasn't in the training yard. He wasn't with the twins, who were in the care of the governess in the upper rooms. The guards at the main entrance hadn't seen him leave. Isabella stood in the center of the great hall and breathed and thought about the look on the false Damien's face in the corridor, about the footsteps that passed the hidden panel, about Serafina's voice saying "if I cannot." And she understood, with the particular cold clarity of a woman who had underestimated a threat once already, that they had moved very quickly. Chapter 6. The Alpha King Beneath the Castle. Aurora knew the tunnels better than anyone expected. She had been exploring since their second day at Blackthorn Keep, the way she explored everything, boldly without asking permission, filing away every detail with the instinctive map-making that was a quality she shared with her brother even if she expressed it differently. She had found the panel in the east corridor, the low door behind the kitchens, and the iron grate at the base of the old tower that opened onto a staircase that went down rather than up. She led them now. Isabella followed her daughter through narrow stone passages that smelled of cold water and old iron, Elias moving just ahead of her with a torch he had thought to pull from the wall at the passage entrance. The tunnels beneath Blackthorn Keep were older than the castle above them. The walls were rough-cut, the ceilings low, the floor uneven. Twice Isabella pressed herself flat against the wall as voices moved somewhere above or beside them, muffled through stone. "Here," Aurora said. She stopped at a heavy iron door set into the wall. There was a bar across the outside, which meant someone was on the inside. Isabella lifted it carefully, slowly, setting it aside without a sound. She pushed the door. The room beyond was small and cold and lit by a single dying torch. Damien was on the floor. He was sitting upright against the far wall, which told her he was conscious. But his head was lowered, his breathing slow and labored, and when he looked up as the door opened, his eyes took a moment to focus. The dulled, struggling effort of someone fighting through something in their blood. "Isabella!" His voice was rough. She crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched in front of him. She pressed a hand to his face. He was cold. Too cold. "What did they give you?" "Something in the wine," he said. "Earlier tonight." He exhaled slowly. "I should have known when Serafina insisted on pouring it herself." His hand found her wrist. "You found me," he said. "Aurora found you," Isabella said. And despite everything, despite the cold and the fear and the anger that was still burning in her chest, she heard her own voice soften. "She mapped half your castle in 3 days." Something moved across Damien's face that looked, in spite of everything, like pride. Elias knelt beside her and opened the small bag he had thought to grab on their way out of the upper corridors. He had packed the healer's antidote kit with the systematic practicality that was entirely his own, the child who planned ahead, who considered outcomes, who prepared for things before they happened. Isabella looked at her son. She looked at the careful way his hands moved, quiet and certain, drawing out the glass vial the healer used for magical toxins. "Where did you learn that?" she said. "I read the healer's instructions when we first arrived," Elias said simply. "I wanted to be prepared." She pressed a hand briefly to his hair. He allowed it. She administered the antidote. She watched the color begin to return to Damien's face slowly, incrementally, the way light returns after a long cloud. His breathing steadied. His grip on her wrist tightened slightly. "You came back," he said. Not accusation, not anger. Just 2 words that held the weight of everything. All the years and all the silence and all the grief they had each carried separately through the same endless seasons. "You came back" meant, "I wasn't sure you would." "You came back" meant, "Even now, after everything, you're here." Isabella looked at him. His face was clearer now, the poison fading, his eyes finally fully focused on hers. "I never stopped," she said. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I spent 7 years being angry at a man who wasn't there that night. I was angry at a lie. And underneath all of it," she stopped, started again. "I never stopped." Damien pulled himself upright. He brought his forehead to hers. Aurora pressed herself under his arm on one side. Elias stayed exactly where he was on the other, his hand resting quietly on Damien's knee. For a long moment, the 4 of them were simply still. Outside the room, somewhere in the passages above them, they could hear shouting. Guards. Confusion. The sound of Lucian's plan falling apart around him. Damien opened his eyes. He looked at his children, at Elias's quiet steadiness and Aurora's fierce, bright-eyed certainty, and then he looked at Isabella. "Tell me again," he said. She understood what he was asking. "I never stopped loving you," she said. "Not for a single day." His exhale was long and slow, and something in his face finally let go. Chapter 7. Forever was always you. Serafina and Lucian were taken before morning. Lucian's illusion abilities, which had been the foundation of everything, failed him completely when faced with 6 trained guards who had been instructed not to look at his face. He was bound and brought before the council before sunrise, unable to impersonate his way free of iron cuffs designed specifically for shifters. Serafina did not resist. She stood in the great hall with a stillness that was not peace but something more complicated. The stillness of a person who had spent so long calculating outcomes that the moment the calculation failed, they had no instinct left for anything else. She said nothing during the proceedings. She accepted the council's judgment without protest. The kingdom learned the truth in pieces the way kingdoms always do. First the whispers, then the formal announcement from the Alpha King himself, standing in the hall with the careful, deliberate weight he brought to everything that mattered. He spoke clearly. He did not spare the details. He told them about the deception, about the illusion, about the 7 years that had been stolen, not from the crown, not from the kingdom, but from a family. The court was very quiet, and then he introduced his children. Aurora stood beside him with her chin up and her hands clasped behind her back, scanning the room with the frank assessment she applied to everything important. Elias stood on his other side, watching the faces in the crowd with those sharp green eyes, reading the room the way he always read everything, carefully, thoroughly, missing nothing. The council formally acknowledged them as heirs of the Blackwood line. Isabella stood slightly behind them and watched this happen and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief, but a quiet, profound grief for the years that could not be returned. For 6 birthdays Damien hadn't known about. For the nights the twins had asked about their father, and she had given them fragments and careful silences. For everything the lie had cost all 4 of them. But grief, she had learned, was not the end of a story. It was the middle of it, the part that proved the story mattered. Damien came to find her that evening. The twins were with the governess, an arrangement that Aurora had very reluctantly accepted after extracting a promise from Damien involving horseback riding lessons before the week was out. Elias had asked, with complete seriousness, whether he could begin studying the castle's defensive perimeter, which Damien had agreed to with an expression that was equal parts amusement and recognition. Isabella was standing at the window of the chamber she had been given, looking out at the castle garden below. The trees were bare in the winter light. The sky was the pale blue of early evening, just before the first stars became visible. She heard him come in. She felt him before she heard him, the way she always had. He came to stand beside her at the window. Elias told me, he said, that you kept the ring. She said nothing for a moment. He tells you things, she said. He trusts me, Damien said simply. I think that surprises him, too. Isabella looked at the garden below. 2 sparrows were fighting over something in the frozen grass. They were very loud about it. I owe you an apology, she said. You don't. I do. She turned from the window. Not for leaving, I couldn't have known what I know now, but for staying gone after there were things I was starting to question. For letting my fear be louder than my children's right to their father. For the years I kept them from you when I should have found another way. Damien looked at her. I spent 7 years not knowing why you left, he said. You spent 7 years believing I didn't want you. We were both living in a story someone else wrote for us. He paused. I don't want to keep living in that story. Neither do I, she said. He reached out and took her hand. Simply, without ceremony. He turned it over and opened her fingers gently, and then he found the chain at her collar and lifted it slowly until the ring caught the evening light. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at her. Come home, he said. Not for the kingdom, not for the court, not for what any of this looks like from the outside. He held her gaze without wavering. Come home because you are the only person I have ever wanted standing beside me, because those 2 extraordinary children deserve a father and a mother in the same house. Because I have been half myself since the morning I woke up and you were gone, and I am done pretending that it was enough. Isabella's eyes were bright. If I say yes, she said, Aurora will redecorate. Damien laughed. That real laugh. The one that started in his chest. I know, he said. I've already accepted this. She let him put the ring back on her finger, where it had always belonged. She let herself lean into him the way she had spent 7 years refusing to want to. His arms came around her the way they always had, without hesitation, without reservation, as though her shape was the one absence his body had been shaped around. Outside, in the castle garden, the sparrows had settled their argument and were quiet. The stars were beginning. 3 days later, the twins found them. It was early morning before anyone else in the castle was properly awake, and Aurora had decided, with the authority she brought to all her decisions, that the family should have breakfast together on the garden terrace, which was cold, but would be improved by a fire, which she had asked a servant to start before anyone else had even opened their eyes. Elias had brought a book. He always brought a book. Damien poured the tea. Isabella cut the bread. Aurora issued opinions about everything and was gently overruled 3 times before the meal was half over. Elias read 3 paragraphs, looked up to check that the others were all still there, and went back to reading. The fire crackled. The winter sun came over the castle wall slowly, warming the stones. Somewhere beyond the garden wall a horse was being led across the cobblestones, the sound of its hooves steady and even. Damien watched his family across the low table. He watched Elias turn a page. He watched Aurora steal the last piece of fruit from her brother's plate and replace it with bread before he noticed, which was the particular kind of logic that was entirely her own. He watched Isabella shake her head at Aurora without actually scolding her, because there were some arguments that simply weren't worth having at breakfast. He reached over and put his hand over Isabella's. She turned her hand and held it. Later that evening, when the twins were finally, genuinely asleep, Aurora with her arm thrown over her face in a posture of extreme dramatic exhaustion, Elias with his book still open on his chest, Damien and Isabella stood in the castle garden in the quiet of the night. The stars were very bright. The air was cold and clean. A torch burned low near the garden wall. Damien wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting lightly on her head, and they stood in a silence that was not empty but full. Full of everything they had come through. Full of the years behind them and the years ahead. Full of the sound of 2 small people breathing in rooms above them, belonging to this place and to each other. 7 years, Isabella said quietly. 7 years, he agreed. She felt his arms tighten slightly. It couldn't take what we are, he said, against her hair, quiet enough that it was only for her. Isabella closed her eyes. She thought about the healer's trembling hands, about the hope she had carried down a corridor in the dark, about 2 heartbeats that had survived everything, the leaving, the silence, the mountains, and the years, and had led her back here, to this garden, to this moment, to the family she had been afraid to want again. She held his arms. No, she said. It couldn't. And for the first time since the night she walked out of Blackthorn Keep before sunrise, Isabella Frost finally believed, not with the cautious, careful hope of someone still braced for loss, but with the deep, settled certainty of a woman who had found her way home, that their story had never been ending. It had only ever been waiting to begin again. And that is where Isabella Frost's story ends. Not in a healer's chamber holding broken news. Not on a dark road leaving before sunrise. Not in 7 years of silence and mountains and raising 2 children alone. It ends in a garden, with her family whole, with the truth finally spoken, with a ring back where it always belonged. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit that button and the bell. A new story drops soon. One last question before you go. Drop it in the comments. Did you suspect the twin twist before Aurora walked up to Damien? I want to know. Like this video if the story got to you, and I will see you in the next one.